One of the key pillars of the Metro Bank Girls in Cricket Fund is supporting new coaches or those considering taking the next step with their coaching qualifications. This year, the fund has delivered an amazing 1,130 mentoring hours for coaches of girls cricket, meaning more confident women and men who are able to champion the future of the girls' game in their club. Hello and welcome to the Wisden Women's Cricket Weekly Podcast. England beat South Africa 3-0 in the T20I leg of their cross-format tour. But how much can they and we learn when the home side rested so many of their big-name players? We'll chat about that series, the WBBL final, and the state of the Women's Championship in today's pod. I'm Rana, and with me today are Katya, Witney, and Ben Gardner. England 3, South Africa 0. Katya, what can we learn from this series? The first game was tight. England successfully chased down 143 in the last over. Second and third games progressively less so, as England scored at more than 10s in both games. Danny White-Hodge scoring 50s in both those games. Other highlights include a fourfer for Sarah Glenn, a tidy return to the side for Lauren Filer, and wickets for Charlie Dean in the final game. So yeah, what have England learnt from this? On paper, 3-0 series win over a team that just got to World Cup final.
Yeah, it kind of feels like one of those series where it's quite easy to take away from, England are good again. But winning a 3-0 T20 series against a side who you probably should beat anyway, who are missing most of their best players in conditions that England are probably the best they are at in, it's harder to take the learnings from it. I think Lauren Filer was a big learning. It was great to see her opening the bowling yesterday, and she bowled pretty quickly. It was good to see her beating the bat for pace as well. But again, there were quite a lot of soft dismissals from South Africa yesterday. I think Dirksen in particular moved up to 3. She gave it away fairly easily. But yeah, I mean, we were talking about it on the other pod, like the whole Alice Capsey dropping and what they're going to learn from that by picking Sophia Dunkley. Well, Sophia Dunkley barely batted in the series, so I don't think they've learned a lot from that. Freya Kemp also went home. She must be injured, but with fitness management concerns. So they haven't learned anything about her and how to replace Danny Gibson when she's not available. So what they've learned is that their good players are good, and that they haven't got any more information on the players that they thought they needed to test out for this series. It's not, it's no one's fault. It's not necessarily blaming England. It's just that kind of series where it's hard to take any meaningful learnings from it. But a 3-0 series victory, you can't exactly ask for much more than that in the situation they were dealt, I guess.
Ben, obviously the nature of the World Cup defeat was such that it provoked quite a high level of scrutiny and criticism. But I almost feel like with England in T20 cricket, you can't get too low when they lose and too high when they win series like this, because of several world-class players they have, Sciver-Brunt, White-Hodge and Eccleston in particular. You can see how on their day they can beat anyone. If Sciver-Brunt or White-Hodge in particular have a good day out, or both of them have good days out on the same day, you can see how they could beat anyone in the world. But at the same time, you're not necessarily seeing the progression from them being a side that could beat anyone in the world on their day to being the best side in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, you pick out those two, and it's pretty stark just how much they dominated with the bat this series. I think over 260 runs between them. I think the rest of the side between them made like just over 150. So they were, they are two brilliant players, and hopefully England have them for a few more years. Yeah, I guess the other thing as well in terms of, England in this versus England in the World Cup is that even in that World Cup, I don't think we were saying that, these players are necessarily bad players. There were some who maybe hadn't come on as much as we thought, but it was also just the pressure nature of it that seemed to get to them, and there just isn't the same pressure in this. I guess, winning the first game, but then it's, it's the guys who we know have the cool heads who have got them over the line in that game. So yeah, it's funny to as you say, beat a good team 3-0 and to come away from it still having the same questions. But and yeah, even when you look at the bowling as well, it's Glenn and Dean who have been the picks of the bowlers, and it's like, well, we know they're both pretty good. I mean, it's encouraging, for players to maintain that level, and that's almost a bit more encouraging than the Sciver-Brunt White-Hodge thing, because then it's like those are actually, they're not going to be around forever. They're not old yet, but they're like close to the end of their careers than the starts. Whereas with those two, we already know they're good, but it is not gratifying just to see your good bowlers bowl really, really well, especially when they're young and have a lot of that to come. But yeah, on the batting, it is just, I don't know, Boucher played well in the third game. That is something, and it obviously doesn't answer the question of what she's going to be like the next time it's in a real pressure situation. But you could also see a player have that kind of game and be like a total shell next time they play international cricket, and that at least seems like it's it's not the case. That is a small positive too.
But yeah, I just couldn't help escape the feeling that, you know, South Africa are without Katya and Cap. So is it an environment different, there's no pressure, or is it just as simple as the quality of opposition is just completely different? Because we talk about Boucher not having a great World Cup. The game that really sticks out for me, obviously there were the drop catches against West Indies, but it was actually scoring 8 off 20 against South Africa in the group stage game, where people didn't talk about it because England ended up winning that game, and it was an important win for England at the time. At the time we thought, great, they're not going to play Australia in the next round, and they didn't play Australia, and we know how that worked out. Fun. I always think the phrase closer to the end of their career than the start is an interesting one, because no one says that when someone's just gone past the halfway point in their career.
Yeah, that's true.
It's always when they're much, much closer to the end of their careers than the beginning. Just on Danny White-Hodge, just a bit of appreciation for her. I sometimes think that she's not talked about enough for what she's done in T20 cricket. So we normally judge a player based on hundreds and 50s, which is pretty arbitrary. If you judged it on 75s, she is by a mile England's best T20 player. So she's got 9 75 plus scores in T20Is. The only other England player to do it more than 3 times is Charlotte Edwards with 5. And then you've got Beaumont and Siva Brunt on 3 each. So miles ahead on that front. And also another player who I don't think gets enough praise for her work in T20s is Sarah Glenn. Already England's 5th leading wicket taker in the format, only averages 15, goes at less than a run a ball, and in 2024 she's taken 25 wickets at 10 in T20Is, only just turned 25 herself as well. So I think she's such an important wicket-taking threat when she's got a very simple, I guess, approach of just targeting the stumps all the time. And there's some chat about whether or not England should have 3 spinners in their side all the time, regardless of conditions. And if you're going to play 3 spinners in South Africa, you're probably going to play spinners everywhere in the world. And I thought it was quite important that those 3 spinners showed why they play every time. Katya, you mentioned Sophia Dunkley. This isn't to criticise her series necessarily, but it's quite interesting that England chose to go back to Dunkley when they made the decision to drop Capsey, because the chat around the Capsey omission was that she's on a downward trend. Her numbers aren't that good recently, but that is also the same with Sophia Dunkley. So that's quite an interesting selection, even regardless of how she did in the series.
Yeah, well, we spoke about it a little bit on the Patreon, that dropping Capsey was almost not the real story in that. It was that they dropped Capsey and as you said, on a downward trend thing, but they didn't bring really anyone in to replace her. Dunkley has spent a lot of the winter going around with England as almost a spare part. She barely played in the World Cup because she wasn't getting in the side. Earlier in this year, she got displaced by Maya Boucher in New Zealand. And she hasn't really done anything since to warrant a recall back to the side. If you're going by kind of traditional score runs and get back in the side, she had an okay 100, but it was actually I think it was her worst 100 she's had by quite a long way. Apart from that, in domestic cricket, other than the 100, she's not really been doing anything either. And before she was dropped from the side, she was given a very extended run in the side as an opener after doing well in the 100 in 2022. And now she's being tried at number 3, which is a position that she rarely bats in for Capsey. And it just feels a little bit like going back to someone too soon without giving them a proper chance. I feel like it's almost quite harsh on Dunkley to keep putting her back in that environment. And in the first T20I and in the second T20I, she looked pretty poor as well. She looked like she hadn't done the addressing that needs to be done over some issues in her technique. And it feels a bit unfair to kind of put her straight back in that situation. That's nothing on Dunkley. I'm sure Dunkley has the talent and has the ability to be a huge part in England's plans in all formats for a very long time. But sometimes players need to be given that time and space to go away and develop. And I feel like Dunkley hasn't been given that time. And I think that's a running theme with other players that England have gone away from and then gone back to too quickly. It's almost like when you're dropped, you're either completely discarded or you're kept around and not given that space to grow that you might need. And that almost feels like it's what they're doing with Dunkley. Like, she's in the test squad still as well, and she's been kept around a lot, carried around the World Cup, and it just kind of feels a little bit like she's been on the periphery of that group for so long that there's been no space given.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in theory, it's not the time thing. You know, in theory, a player could have 2 weeks out and they just rediscover their spark. The issue is that she's had time out, but the returns are, as you say, domestically at least, you know, as low as they have been at any point of her career.
you can't need someone to earn a recall and to, you can't just keep picking someone and you've seen it before and think like, well, we've seen it before and there's a chance they do it this time. I wonder if there's also perhaps that England, like I wonder how they talk internally about the quality of coaching underneath the top level, and if they feel that with a player like Dunkley they actually want to keep her around because they think that the best coaching she's going to get is with the national side, and especially like maybe across the summer it's okay, but actually in a winter if she's not going to go and get an overseas deal like the BBL or something, then actually what does her wins look like? Is she just going to be like sort of sitting on the sofa doing a bit of gym versus like being around the England team? And and sometimes they might see something in the nets and it gets into the middle and doesn't quite work. Different sort of example, but I think back to just over a year ago when they picked Izzy Wong at the end of that summer, and that was just clearly a player who's just really struggling technically, and you wonder how that could not have been apparent in the nets when it was just so obvious when she stepped onto the field and when it had been the thing that had been plaguing her through that summer. And so you do wonder if there's like what is going on there that means that England aren't sort of able to assess when players like good talented players are back in form and ready to be picked, I guess.
Ben, me and you had a disagreement on the Patreon about what South Africa did this series. So, we mentioned they rested quite a few high-profile players, especially by the end of the series. You think that that's a bad thing? South Africa shouldn't be doing that?
Well, I came around a bit to your way of thinking, but I think especially for the third game, and I guess from one point of view, they'd already lost the series. Maybe that is a chance to go and play a few more players, but also it shows that even the team that you were playing wasn't, strong enough, and then you weaken it more. And so that team for the third game, I think only had about half of them had played in that World Cup final. And then even things like being slightly almost more flexible what you're going to do. So I think their plan was to rest Brits for that game, but then Wolvaart gets ill, so they can't pick her. But then you still rest Brits and they're just kind of in the squad. So actually you then end up with like a completely new opening pair. And I think that, it is good to see how new players get along, but we've seen this also with other teams at other times, that you've got to blend that balance of like the experienced players being on the pitch so that the younger players can also be on the pitch and see how they go about it. If you have a team that is like as inexperienced as they were in that game, then you wonder how much are they going to learn. And yeah, you wonder if there could have been flexibility maybe with Cap as well, who basically missed this series to play in the WBBL, but actually has been knocked out of the BBL for a couple of weeks, I think. So she could have been, got on a plane and played. But it's always tricky, and you do need to give games players, especially we were talking about it in the office, when South Africa's domestic structure is not hugely strong and also is pretty sparse in terms of how frequently they play fixtures. So actually, if you want to figure out who is the next best players, you kind of do have to pick them every now and then. So there is that angle to it as well.
Yeah, Katya, how do you see it? My argument was essentially if you're not gonna blood in youngsters and see how they're doing 5 minutes after a World Cup, you're never gonna do it.
Yeah, I'll take the middle ground. I think you can do it. I do think that
don't get me wrong, I wasn't jumping off the sofa being like, yeah, they rested Cap.
Yeah, but I think they rested, obviously Wolvaart was ill, and then they rested Brits and Malaba for that last game. They also didn't play Sune Luz in the second game, nor Annika Bosch, and it did kind of feel a bit like a cobbled together of who they can kind of rest and rotate into the side. I'm all for trying new players. We can't have sat here and criticised England for not doing it and then criticised the side for trying new players, but it did kind of feel like they were almost using this series to blood a lot of new players. I think what you said about the domestic system does come into it. And we had Annika Bosch on the pod last week who said that South Africa's system is they play 10 50 over games and 10 T20 over games per year domestically as a side, which is just nowhere near enough. They don't have a women's SA20, and they've only recently made the domestic game fully professional, or more professional than it has been for a long time. So I think it's right that if you are going to bring new players into the international format, this is where you are going to get them that experience, or that high quality experience. There's an element of South Africa's domestic game needs to develop so that this doesn't happen so much, or that so if it does happen, the players who come through are of higher quality and better experience to make the series interesting. But I think there's a wider point about why South Africa felt this was the series to try those new players in. South Africa, England is a big series. These are two of the biggest sides in the world, and there's just been so little resting on this series because it's directly after a World Cup. If you're looking at the ODIs, both South Africa and England have already qualified for the World Cup. They're already in the top 4 in the Women's Championship. There's so little resting on this series that it feels so pointless. If you look at the last T20, it felt like such a low-key kind of both sides resigned and knowing the result before it was even started kind of affair. England were barely celebrating sometimes when they got wickets, and South Africa looked shot right from the moment it started.
Yeah,
it felt like such a lack of spectacle.
As a comparison, what England, for example, they probably don't feel in T20 cricket at least they need to ever do this because they have the 100, where your best uncapped players play against international players regularly. So you need to do less finding out about players and exposing them to those environments. Do you think that series like this, especially one where you have a test match at the end of it as well, should these be multi-format points series like the Ashes is to give it that context? Because there is no context.
Yes, case closed. I don't understand why it's not. If you're playing, I can understand why it's not a point series if you're just doing ODIs and T20s. That feels fairly farcical. But having a test match in there, this is essentially the Ashes. These are the exact same matches that the Ashes would be, but there's no point system in place here. I'm not saying that putting points into it would instantly make it like a brilliant series, but it just gives it some other element of intrigue and jeopardy. You know, if South Africa still had, even after losing the first 2, if they still had a possibility of winning the series, then perhaps they don't rest just as many of those players for that game. And if we could make the point, I don't know what, but if we could make the points or winning a multi-format series count for something else, that might be another way to add something into it. But if there's going to be a few, should be careful when saying more women's tests. There's going to be more women's tests than there's been previously under the new FTP. That doesn't mean there's going to be a lot of women's tests. But if the ICC are going down this route of trying to put women's tests in place in some of these white ball series on the end of them, I don't understand why they're not also putting point systems in place. It seems farcical that it's only in the Ashes we play for points. No other women's side ever plays for points in a multi-format series, and I just think that's ridiculous.
Yeah, and I wonder also, actually, we're going to talk about the ODI Women's Championship later in the show, but I think we have mentioned it at some point in the past that could a structured women's international cricket be where it's actually multi-format series that feed into an overall league? I mean, you now, with the new FTP, have 5 active test teams, so actually...
At the moment, it feels like New Zealand, for example, they are choosing not to.
Yes, yeah.
And it feels like, could you do anything to entice the board, like a carrot?
And the previous IC regime were almost actively discouraging of women's test cricket, and it's kind of grown in spite of that. Whereas, you know, the new incoming chair, it is under him that, you know, India women started playing more tests. So actually, if there is an outlook to have more women's tests as part of that, then maybe we can. It's tricky because that new FTP is now, you know, set in stone, so you're not going to get it for a little while. But when does that run to, that FTP? Do you remember? 2029. So I don't know if you can... For
a pod in 2028.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I'm trying to work out if it could go after the next World Cup. Even that is going to come too soon, but yeah.
But it just kind of feels like women's bilateral series exist from World Cup to World Cup, and every single bilateral series played is, what can you learn from this in relation to the next World Cup? When the ODI series starts, it will be in relation to the ODI World Cup that's happening next year. We've just had a T20 World Cup, and it seems pretty meaningless that these T20s have happened directly afterwards.
It's a really good point, and I wonder if it's actually because there are so many World Cups nowadays. Back in the good old days when you only had a 50 over World Cup and you had 4 years between it and nothing in the middle. Back then, series were big in their own right. In men's and women's cricket, you got a series and you're just playing the series for the sake of the series. And now it feels a bit different with how often, you know, how many T20 World Cups we had? 3 in the last 4 years, you know, and that's basically the norm now. So yeah, other thing about this series is England have the Ashes next month. So for them, less of a need to change things because they probably want to fine tune plan A rather than
I guess so, but I still do think for the decider, and obviously you don't know what team the opposition are going to name before you go into it, but with the series one, you do wonder because, you know, you talk about, it is true that England don't need to, you know, blood in players so much because they do have this proving ground in the 100, but we also talked after that World Cup exit that some of those players, like the likes of Boucher especially and Dunkley as well, are not having to be the players that their team is depending on. Yeah. And so if you rest Sciver-Brunt and White Hodge for that third game, then because Boucher played all right in that last game, but she makes 35. She would actually learn quite a lot, I think, from batting through to 55 not out and being the player that sees the side home, because she's like, oh, they're not here, I'm the one that has to do this. And that is one of the things that is, I think, missing a bit from how England are getting those young players in. So a bit more rest and rotation for England, maybe not quite as much as South Africa did, but I think that they could, because they only made they've used 13 players for the series with Bell, Filer and Glenn playing 2 games each, so they've stuck with a pretty strong core there.
Yeah, and some good moments for some of the younger South African players. Elise Marie Marks had a really good game in the first T20. She took 3 for 19. 21-year-old Seema Halubi looked sharp in moments, and Anne-Marie Dirksen had some good moments with the batting slightly higher up in the order than usual.
Can we talk about the most extraordinary thing that's ever happened on a cricket field?
Go on.
Which is
big claim.
The Nat I think it's up there. It's the Nat Sciver-Brunt dead ball. Do you remember this? So
I do, yeah.
She's got a flannel in the back of her trousers as she's running in. The flannel drops. Her heel kicks up, sort of just in her gather. Kicks the flannel up, which would already be sort of silly if that happened. Kicks it up onto her hand as it comes through in its backswing, and then she manages to bowl both the ball and the flannel. As I can't remember the South Africa batterers, but she sounds like absolutely perplexed. And then it's called dead, and she re-bowls it. But yeah, it's an extraordinary coincidence. I think the only thing I can think of that's similar is, do you remember Andrew Strauss demolishing his sunglasses? It feels very like that. That's like, there is no way you could do that in 100 times if you tried, and yet it somehow happened.
You need a hole in the flannel.
Yeah.
The BBL final happened yesterday. You'll hear more about it with Lauren on the next pod. Her Brisbane Heat side lost the final in a rain-affected game against the Renegades at the MCG. Hayley Matthews was player of the match, 69 off 61 and 2 wickets. She managed the innings brilliantly after they were 23 for 3 early doors. The Heat, in truth, were a bit sloppy. There were overthrows, misfields, etc. There's one very village moment with Deandra Dottin where for the Renegades, where she was run out facing a ball. So she's running in and her bat gets stuck in the ground on the crease. And initially no one appeals. But then keeper Georgia Redmayne then very politely asked the umpire what they thought as she was putting the bails back on. And it was so late that had me wondering, Ben, when is the latest someone can appeal? Because it was a good 8 seconds after the bails are whipped off.
Yeah, but you can actually appeal up until the next ball is bowled, basically. So you're actually... I don't know how that interacts with possibly on-screen replays that you could sometimes get. Like, and if there should be, if there is a rule in place that means that you don't show those kind of replays until the next ball is bowled, but then that might confuse fans in the stadium, kind of thing. Like, what's this going on up there? But that's the rule in any case, and so they were fine to appeal, even if it was very polite, which
very polite.
We should encourage politeness.
Almost looked like a joke when she was appealing, and she couldn't really believe it when it was given out.
Yeah, whereas Dottin, I think, knew straight away.
She knew straight away, and I think the umpire did as well, because the umpire was very quick and serious when they did the referral.
Does the umpire have to take that as an appeal? Is there any interpretation that the umpire?
Yeah, it was obviously covered in the laws what counts an appeal, and it's just like an appeal is just saying how is that to the umpire. So,
but yeah, the Renegades got over the line despite Jess Jonathan playing a blinder, 44 off 28. Sophie Molyneux did an excellent job marshalling her troops, very steely, didn't show any emotion until the very, very end, even though the game was won with a few balls to go. An amazing turnaround for the Renegades, who finished rock bottom in 2023 with just 2 wins from 14. I was trying to work out what was different. They basically struggled a lot for wickets last year. There's no real regular wicket takers. They had Hayley Matthews last year, but she had like a normal year, whereas this year she was one of the best players in the comp. And Molyneux's had an outstanding competition. And in Illingworth, they've got like a really young, different bowler to what you genuinely come across, just genuinely quite sharp. I guess you'll play for Australia sooner rather than later. Moving on, Ben, there's been an important Women's Championship series between Ireland and Bangladesh. First, what is the Women's Championship and why is it important?
So for right now, it's a tournament involving the top 10 teams in the world, an ODI competition. And the most important thing basically is that the top 6 teams, or the top 6 teams don't have to go through the qualifying event for the next World Cup. So teams play 3-match series. They don't play everyone because otherwise you have to have India play Pakistan. We know that's not allowed to happen. But they play 8 series each. And then the bottom 4 go into a qualifying event. So that's what the Women's Championship is. It expands from next time out, with Zimbabwe getting added as the other full member with a women's side. So yeah, that's Women's Championship for you. But then what's
happened this week? Ireland, Bangladesh.
It's been a hugely exciting one, yeah. So Bangladesh beat Ireland 3-0, which I suppose is not unexpected,
especially given it's in Bangladesh.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it puts Bangladesh on 19 points, and so actually, if you go down the towards the bottom of the table, you've got Sri Lanka, who have played all their games on 22 points. New Zealand, who have one series left to play, which is in Australia, have 20 points. Pakistan are done. They've played all their games on 17 points. But you've got Bangladesh have now played. They've got 3 games left. They've got 19 points. West Indies have 6 games left and they've got 14 points. And West Indies and Bangladesh play each other. So if Bangladesh win one game, they'll move ahead of New Zealand's current total. And it's possible New Zealand don't add a point to that. And if Bangladesh don't win a game, that means West Indies win all 3 of those games. And then they'd be only 1 win in their series against India away from also overtaking that New Zealand total. And then I guess it's possible that, that 2 of those sides overtake Sri Lanka and push them down. So it is quite exciting. It's all hotting up.
Why Bangladesh in it?
So
the improving side, but you wouldn't necessarily say they're top 6.
Yeah, but they just have had. So firstly, to give them credit, they've just had a pretty good campaign. I mean, they drew that series against India when Harmanpreet Kaur got very angry. I can't remember about what now, but
it was about umpiring decisions, and particularly an umpiring decision in relation to her. And then they had that incident in the final match, which Bangladesh won, I think,
They tied
it, so that they leveled the series or kept the series level. And then there was a lot of kind of verbal argy-bargy during the presentations and during the trophy presentation between the 2 sides.
Did she refuse to shake hands?
I think there was, and then there was a comment made about umpiring towards the Bangladesh captain, who then led the side off the field in protest, I think.
Yes. So that series in
Manchester. I just wanted to get up the Harmanpreet Kaur quotes from that game. They batted really well, batted according to the situation. They were taking those singles, which were very crucial. In between, we leaked a few runs, but when we were batting, we controlled them very well. But as I mentioned earlier, some pathetic umpiring was done, and we were really disappointed about some of the decisions given by the umpires. So yeah, Harmanpreet wasn't happy.
No, but it did show that Bangladesh are a team that can compete with and rattle those good teams. They then drew a series with Pakistan as well, and they did that despite being bowled out for 81 in the first game. So they bowled out for 81 and then defended or tied. So they've had 2 ties in this competition as well, and then won the Super Over in that game. Oh, maybe that third ODI they were supposed to play Super Over and didn't as well. But anyway, we can move past that. But so they've had 2 good results there, and they've also, I guess you could say, been slightly fortunate to have a few washouts, especially in a series in New Zealand, where New Zealand won it 1-0 with 2 washouts. I guess if that had played to a finish, New Zealand might have won those 2 games and then been pretty safe now. But as it is, and then they also had a couple of shots against Sri Lanka. So that
is actually huge.
So
to have 4 washouts in games where you're probably not favourites.
Yeah, I guess the Sri Lanka series, they'd look back on that now and think that, well, given that they then hosted India and Pakistan and drew with them both, that they actually might have had a decent chance in that series. But still,
yeah. Interesting. Well, lots of context around those series in the weeks and months to come. That is everything for today's show. Thanks to the Metro Bank Girls in Cricket Fund and the delivery of 1,130 mentoring hours, more coaches of girls cricket are delivering brilliant sessions for their clubs and helping to grow the game. If you want to find out more about the fund, visit metrobankonline.co.uk/cricket.